Welcome to the first Kellogg Conversations. I'm Dr. Gavin Svenson. I'm the director of the Museum of Natural History. I'm a trained entomologist. I've worked on praying mantis biology for much of my career. And I come to this particular conversation about resilience and future and environment with that context of biodiversity and insect evolution long term. We have assembled a panel to contrast against what I bring to this conversation. Many people have called me the doom and gloom guy when I talk about where we are with climate and environment and insect diversity and things like that. But I think those are the realities that we have to be aware of, and they're going to be the panel of hope and solutions as charting what a resilient future looks like. But just to put it into context, we're at a turning point for humanity. I think it's really important for us to be aware of what's happening, what the data says. 2023, 2024, and 2025 were the three averaged hottest years on record post-industrial era. And the average temperature for 2024 was at 1.6 degrees Celsius. So as a benchmark to that, we, as humanity, are supposed to keep ourselves to 1.5 degrees Celsius, or we will start losing coral reefs, we'll start losing environments as they are, and as they have been. Another benchmark that I usually use is a long-term study that was performed in Germany. I think it was about 20 to 30 years, and it was looking at insect abundance, flying insect abundance. And over that period of time, there was a 75% decline in abundance of insects during that period of time. So as an entomologist, I've done field work all over the world, and I've noticed this pattern myself. And this is not just a pattern of decline of insect diversity and abundance within agricultural context or urban context. It's also happening in pristine natural rainforests worldwide. So something's happening. We don't actually know exactly what's happening, but it's not a single cause. So what does that mean to us? We're a part of the system. Humanity's future is a part of the world around us. For 10,000 years, we've enjoyed a stable environment. That's a period of time where we developed agriculture, we developed a built environment, we developed all those things that buffer us from the world around us and give us the ability to sit inside a controlled, temperate environment like this. So as soon as you start destabilizing that environment, it's going to influence our health, our economy, our way of life, and we don't really want to do that. So what does that mean to us long term? A lot of people think about environmentalism as the context of preserving the world as it is, right? But I'm an evolutionary biologist and think extinction is normal. That's just a way of the world. 99.9% of species have gone extinct and don't exist anymore. That's just a normal rate. The problem is when it happens at a really alarming rate. And these are the patterns that we're starting to detect now. And this is not unprecedented. We've gone through 5 extinction events, mass extinction events. And although the catalysts for it were different, ultimately it was climate change, right? So here we are, same thing. This is starting to happen again. And what is worrying is what that rate of change really is. So the world won't care, right? The world will move on and adapt. Life will adapt. Maybe my insect group of study, praying mantises, will become super intelligent and take over the world. Who knows? But really, we need to be concerned about ourselves, about our future as humanity. If we want to be here, we want to chart a world that is resilient and gives us that future sustainability. So adaptation is critical to that, and there's a lot of reasons for optimism. So we brought together a panel to explore what nature and our shared past can teach us about surviving what is going to change. There's no doubt about it. The world is going to change, and that change is caused by a lot of the activities that we're engaged with as humans. But we need to achieve a long-term sustainable solution. And don't overlook the simple lessons that we can learn from the natural environment. We can learn from our own cultural history, and we can learn from more sophisticated technological ways of advancement. So our participant today, Dr. Joanna Bagnowski, who's a Kellogg Fellow, department lecturer in environmental science at the University of Oxford, And then Professor Natalie Seddon, who's Professor of Biodiversity and the founding director of Nature-Based Solutions Initiative in the Department of Biology at the University of Oxford. And then Dr. Ben Bulgar, Kellogg Visiting Fellow and Executive Director of Projects for the King's Foundation. And then last but not least, Dr. Hannah Fluck, Senior National Archaeologist at the National Trust. So the format today is each is going to give about a 5 to 7 minute free-form response to some of the questions that I have. And then if there's enough time, we'll have some crosstalk between the group. They'll ask each of the questions, and then we'll try to open it up for audience participation so that you can ask some of your own questions. But so, Joanna, you describe yourself as a zoologist with an interest in ecology, animal behavior, and biodiversity conservation, and you've done a lot of work looking at how species adapt to human-altered environments. So what is it that we can learn from natural adaptation? Because it's going to be really important to us. And how do we actively shape a more sustainable future?
Thank you very much. When I first got the brief for this event, I thought, can I be a bit cheeky? Because if we think about sustainability in an environmental sustainability context, and we look at it from an evolutionary perspective, the lesson is take everything you've learned from evolution and throw it out the window. Because in evolutionary terms, what you want to do as an individual is to breed as much as you can and hog as many resources as you can, because that will ensure your survival. It's very kind of nature red in tooth and claw. And that's not really what we're trying to achieve through sustainability and ensuring a future for us. But then I thought, okay, if we put that to one side and maybe scratch the surface a bit more and think about what we can learn, not just in sustainability and environmental context, but sustainability of institutions or sustainability of organizations or sustainability of societies. What can we bring from the animal world? And one thing that I thought about was not having a single point of failure. So if you look at a species, you want to have genetic variation within that species, because otherwise, if all the individuals are very similar, all it takes is one disease, one event, and the entire species is likely to be wiped out. In the context of humans, if we take it to organizations or services that we use, we really need to have a bit of decentralization. If everybody is relying on one system, be it an online system or being an institution or one shop, if that shop fails, if that system fails, where does that leave us? So we want to have some variation in what we use. And another thing, and this is the ecologist in me likes to also talk about relationships, because I think fundamentally humans are all about relationships and how we interact with each other, but also how we interact with the natural world. It's looking at relationships within communities. And here I wanted to give the example of the vampire finch. So vampire finches are little birds that live in the Galapagos Islands. They live in quite tough conditions. If the season is nice and wet, then they have a lot of food, so they have lots of insects flying around. But if the going gets tough, they turn to feeding on blood. And they feed on the blood of Nazca boobies, so slightly bigger birds. And the idea of where that interaction came from is that it started off as a mutualistic relationship. So both sides benefit, because the boobies would allow the finches to pick insects and other invertebrates off their bodies. So the finches would provide a service, cleaning the boobies off the parasites, and in turn they would get food, right? So you can see that with many species in many contexts. You have oxpeckers that would feed on the insects that sit on wildebeest or rhinos, and that was the same relationship. The big booby would have a lot of pests and the little finch would come and pick them off. But when the going got tough and there were no insects to feed on, the finches cotton on to the fact that if they nip a little bit harder, they can get a nice nutritious meal out of the boobies. And I think this is something that we need to consider. So relationships that we have in human societies and our communities can be all well and good if there's enough of everything. But what happens if there's not enough of a resource? Where will that relationship go? Will it go south, or do we have some sort of a backup plan? So these are the 2 points I wanted to start off with. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Next, Natalie, you founded the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative, and you've been working hard to link research, policy, and practice to address ecological challenges and restore and protect nature. Can you expand on what you mean by nature-based solutions and how they play a role in charting a more sustainable future?
Thank you very much. I'm tempted to just respond to what I've heard and just ditch the little speech that I'd written, but I think I will draw my notes because I'd like to come back, because I think that the polycrisis is a crisis of relationship. I think that climate change, biodiversity loss, social inequality are all symptoms of a very broken system, and at the root cause of all the challenges we face are a challenge of relationship with ourselves, with our communities, and especially with the more than human, or the rest of the living world of which we're a part. And so I just want to sort of share some reflections that I have about the relationship. I will answer your question in my own way, but I don't want to just talk about nature-based solutions. I want to talk about the bigger piece around what resilience is, I think. And I think we need some caution about the word resilience. I think many think of it in terms of like an ability to bounce back, to return to a former state. But in the living world, bouncing back doesn't really happen, ever. A river after a flood, a woodland after a drought, a species under climate change, a community even after loss, none of these returns to exactly where it was. Something has changed. And the question is whether that system, when it returns, or through its change, still has enough life, still has enough diversity and memory and connection to reorganize what matters most. So I think resilience is less about a state of returning and more about keeping the conditions for renewal alive. So ecology, so I have a training as an ecologist and an evolutionary biologist, but I now call myself an interdisciplinary researcher, and my work increasingly draws on the social sciences and the arts, actually. But I see huge synergy between all of these disciplines. But ecology, Western ecology and the ecology held by indigenous and place-based traditions around the world show us that really resilient systems are usually really diverse, that they have quite a lot of redundancy in the system, so that if one ecological function, one species, one pathway is weakened by a particular stress, others can carry that part of the load. Resilient systems also have connectivity, but not so much that disturbance cascades in lots of different directions at once. Resilient systems also have refugia, those places where life can persist through extremes. And they also have memory in soils and seed banks, in trees, in animal movements, in seasonal rhythms, and so forth. That's a very different model of resilience from the one that dominates many human systems. We often optimize for efficiency, optimize our yields, speed, control, things like that. We often simplify our landscapes. We're constantly simplifying our landscapes. We try and simplify our supply chains. We remove slack. We remove redundancy from the system. And then they're surprised when the systems turn out to be really brittle. And there's lots of evidence for this. And nature suggests that resilience isn't built at all by simplification. It's built by relationships. I think this is this kind of recurrent theme. And I think that's where heritage comes in too. Cultural heritage isn't just about buildings and objects and archives. Of course, that's important. It's also, accumulated knowledge about how to live in a place, how to read the weather and understand the soils and so forth. How to celebrate the seasonal return and so forth. And it's held in ceremony and story and practice. And I'm increasingly recognizing the incredible importance of that sort of knowledge, that way of knowing, in addition to other ways of knowing that nonetheless have lots of prominence and privilege in the decision-making space. So I think there's a lot of resonance between, say, ecological memory and cultural memory. Both help life to persist through disruption. And I think for me, as I said at the outset, this has some direct implications for sustainability and for nature-based solutions. We can't treat nature just as, vital infrastructure. I have said that before, and I do know and recognize the importance of really explaining to people in the West, in the modern Western industrialized societies, that nature is our life support system, that we need it for flood risk reduction, we need trees in cities to cool them, we need healthy soils for our food and clean water and clean air, and the list goes on, mental health, all these things that are supported by a healthy living world. But if we only ask what nature can do for us, what remains unchanged is the kind of the root driver of the crisis we're trying to address. And I think increasingly my work, and many people working in sustainability, and you've already mentioned it, is this: we need a much more relational approach, which asks, resilience for whom, at what cost, who decides, what should be restored, protected, or allowed to change. What does the resilience mean for the river? What does it mean for the pollinator, the woodland, the local community, the farming community, a future resident who is not yet here? What does resilience mean for them? So I think this is where the next generation, or the emerging generation of sustainability work, is to bring that insight from ecological knowing together with culture and governance and ethics, so that we can protect and restore the ecological foundations of resilience, diversity, connectivity, those things we know are incredibly important for resilience. But we also need to, prioritize, social and cultural foundations, long-term stewardship, really engage with those place-based traditions that have been working with nature as part of nature for thousands of years and have incredible knowledge about what resilience looks like, because those communities have learned, repeatedly over time. They've been subject to climate extremes in various parts of the world, and they have a lot of knowledge about how we can come through those changed but still thriving. So I think, resilience, when we think about resilience, we think about adaptation. It's not so much a property of individuals, or, is this individual resilient? Am I a resilient person? Is this building resilient? Is this institution resilient? It's much more about recognizing that resilience is an emergent property of relationships. And I think there's so many examples to push back slightly against your point. I think life is defined in many ways by symbiosis, by cooperation. Some of the major evolutionary transitions are defined not by competition, not by selfish genes, but actually by incredible symbiosis. And so I'm very keen on the term, and I'm finishing now, can we think of the world not so much as an Anthropocene, which is defined by change and disruption, but more a symbiocene, which is defined by symbiosis, by cooperation and collaboration. And we don't have to look very far to find examples, not only in nature, but also in human communities, traditional communities around the world, who have those ways of relating and who are very, very resilient. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. I have lots of questions for both of you, but I'll skip, but I'll just make the comment that does anybody know what the percentage of biodiversity that is known on Earth? When we're talking about resiliency and we're talking about all these connections, do you know what we know and what we don't know? It's a fraction. So I'm a biodiversity person and described all sorts of new species. Understanding the environment is also about understanding a baseline and understanding what the differences are. So when an environment changes, how do we measure what that change is? It's incredibly important, but we don't even know what's out there to understand what that change really is and what it means to us. But moving on, I'll go to Ben. You're the executive director for projects at the King's Foundation, which provided seed funding to create the Global Center for Healthcare and Urbanization at Kellogg College, and more recently to establish scholarships which aim to foster research into the role for nature in health and well-being. Tell us about how your work contributes to healthy, sustainable communities, and what are the lessons you've learned in helping us build the resilience needed to face urban or uncertainties of the climate crisis.
Yeah, Well, maybe I'll build on this theme of relationships because I think that's quite key to our work. So I trained as an architect and have spent a lot of time doing everything from building scale things to new settlements or even country plans. We're involved in Guyana, creating the national strategy, sustainability strategy for sustainable towns and cities. And I guess I'll try and give some practical examples. So 15 years ago, we were doing 2 new settlements in the UK, and you have to create an environmental statement, and one didn't exist. Sustainability tend to exist at the scale of the home, and we were getting quite frustrated because a lot of sustainability actually is just walkable neighborhoods or, you know, different metrics. And so rather than just energy usage within a building, we saw it as a more complete connected system. So I got the building research establishment to audit these 2 new settlements of between 5,000 and 7,000 homes, and they created their metrics. And I suddenly realized that because we like counting things and we quantify everything in life in order to give it a value or a certain type of value, it was about the quantum of everything. So I also realized that a lot of people got, you know, when you look at sustainability, social, economic, environmental, a lot of people were getting, communities we work with were getting confused by what we meant by environmental, because that included human-made systems in the environment as well, buildings. So I created what we call a community capital framework, which took the pillars of sustainability, but we split it out. So we had natural capital, social capital, financial capital, and built capital. So natural and built, at least, were a bit more easy to understand for the communities we were working with. But then because I felt that it was not just about the quantities of things, but about the relationships between the things that made them more resilient, we created a cross-cutting set of values, which were rooted, connected, balanced, resilient, and prudent. So, you know, if you take the capital of natural capital and you say rooted, it implies indigenous or you know, if you take connected and natural, it might be ecosystems, you know, and because things crawl and fly and water flows, obviously systems that are connected tend to be richer ecosystems potentially than pockets of woodland or green space. So that completely transformed our thinking because we were actually, and because I'm quite a visual person, I began to see it less like a Jenga set where you remove one bit of the Jenga and it tumbles, and more like a spider's web where if you pull a piece out, it just readjusts. And so that is creating that system basically then allows you to asset map in any place. And we've developed this from the island of Sark all the way to villages and towns and cities around the world, and it's quite effective because you map with communities who also value their place, because the heritage thing I think is very important. You know, New Orleans, when Hurricane Katrina came through, we sent a team out to look at planning it, and obviously a lot of it would be thought relocate. You know, you don't want to be in a place that's susceptible to flooding, but people don't want to relocate because that's their home. You know, so in Guyana, where we're working on the capital city, it's 1.5 meters below sea level, and one could say it's not resilient unless the pumps are working to pump the water out. But again, there are ideas for Silica City building on high ground, but most of the trade and economy, surprise, surprise, on the coast. So people don't really want to move away. So I think, you know, at the scale of the city, what we're doing is we're developing things that we call integration plans, because particularly in the built environment, having excluded heritage for the most part and nature for the best part of 100 years and siloed everything, you know, it's called the sort of prominent planning ideology methodology is one of zoning, where you literally zone the housing estates, the shopping centres, the schools, everything's zoned, and then you have to drive for the rest of your life to get anywhere. Whereas historical settlements are integrated, you know, but the current system doesn't like integration because each of the zones has its own investment pool. They've got their rules, they've got their regulations. So drawing an integrated system, an integrated settlement is the easy part. Actually getting it through planning, regulating for it is really, really, really difficult. So we've started to think with communities about the 5 layers, very, very simply. First layer, and because people think of housing first, think of the government now, it's housing numbers. You know, it's like the worst metric ever to talk about what a community should be doing and what the crisis is. The crisis is an affordable one and a social one, you know, and part of it is housing people, but housing numbers is probably a really misplaced metric, I personally think. So if you think tip it on its head and say, well, let's think about water first, because without that, there's not much life. And then so that's blue, the blue layer. Then you might have the ecological layer that springs from the water. That's green, and that is sort of nature. And then you have movement, let's say human movement, which is the red layer, and that's the traces across the landscape that through history, you see those layers of where people have gone from A to B to get from somewhere to somewhere else. And then where those crossing points happen, that tends to be the point of settlement, because you get centres that are created through when two places cross, you get the movement economy, and that tends to be where trade happens. So the high street, the marketplace, and that kind of thing. And then last but not least, so that tends to imply commercial activity where the centres are. And then you might get the housing to fill in the gaps. And within that system, things have completely different frequencies of change. So if you think about 4 or 5 frequencies of change, take Lincoln, for instance, which has been around for a good few thousand years. The main streets in Lincoln's Roman, so that's been there for over 2,000 years. But the hill's been there for a very long time, steep hill in Lincoln. So you have sort of natural systems that are very slow frequencies of change. And then you have human movement systems that are slightly quicker, and then right at the top you have fashion. And so you have, which is on let's say a 15 retail fashion cycles are changing every week, it seems. You confuse those layers, if you think of them as layers, at your peril. So if you put a big box retail like we used to have, seems an eternity ago, we used to shop by putting lots of things in big department stores. And I can remember 20 years ago saying, well, that's not going to happen for long. We'll have distribution centres on the edges of towns and cities, and we'll bring things in with smaller vehicles. Well, now we'll probably be bringing things in by drones. So I think, when you begin to understand it, towns and cities as living organisms that are completely integrated with natural systems, you begin to look at that in terms of how's it going to change when certain things like heat or water apply to a system, and you actually think, right, it needs to adjust, it needs to adapt, as you said, and that can adapt at many levels, and actually part of it you can manage. The Dutch are very good at managing water. We've exported lots of architecture around the world that had verandas to keep out the sun and create shade, or we're probably needing to import those now because it's getting a bit warmer. And I think part of the question was the simple lessons we can learn. There are some very, very simple things that we can do to adapt. So I am quite hopeful. I just don't think my main issue at the moment, and what I spend most of my life doing, is trying to integrate the disparate parts which don't want to talk to each other. And that's where, and you need an integrated system, and you need people to think about the relationships between their fiefdom and their sort of world and other people's worlds, because it is one connected system.
Is that the point? The connectivity is lost because you can't start over. You can't take the built environment and wipe it clean and then build your perfect system. So what's the missing feature?
Well, I think the missing features is the way we think, the way that we've, I don't want to offend any scientists because I'm not a scientist, but I think we learn to isolate things in order to understand them. And that we're now getting to a point where we now know things aren't, you isolate things at your peril because everything's connected. So it's artificial. Everything we've created by isolating things are relative, I wouldn't say totally artificial, but they're an approximation. And so most people like to create clean systems within their own worlds. They externalize everything and say, no, this is mine. And then you end up with everyone arguing with everything else. And you look at the solutions and you think that's like the worst possible solution to anything. And then you realize it's come about by 4 or 5 different experts, all giving very good advice within their particular specialism, but they've not talked together and come up with a solution that satisfies the best approximation of everything. So I think that's the challenge for us, is to work together across silos and to think in an integrated way. And I think it's easy. We do it through inquiry by design, we call it, 100, 200 people working together in quite an organized fashion, technical briefings, working in mixed groups towards collective master plans, and then going through sort of refinement processes where we get the more or less strategy right. And only when we've got the kind of integrated plan that everyone's more or less happy with, do we say to the experts, right, you can now go off into your huddle, the transport people, you can work out the transport plan, the ecologists, you can work out your plan. That's fine. And then it's a feedback loop. But I'd say that's the challenge.
Great. Heritage. It seems like we've arrived at a really good segue into talk
nice
about
intro.
heritage. Yeah, it's a great intro.
Thanks.
I was going to ask you a question, but I think you've got so much material to comment on in terms of your work.
Yeah, thank you. So, firstly, it's very nice to be back here. I left Oxford in the year 2000, having completed my undergrad in Arkananthus, so it was a little bit of a walk down memory lane to get here. And I think when I left, if you told me that this was what I would be doing now, I wouldn't have believed you. I was determined I was going to study human evolution. Stone tools was my obsession. Got a PhD in that. But in a very funny way, the skills that I gained in my time here and in those subsequent studies have become incredibly useful in the career that I've accidentally forged, working in climate change policy and trying to integrate heritage and archaeology into responses to the environmental crises. And I've started to think about what it is, in my experience and that of many others as archaeologists, that makes us really very useful in thinking about this crisis. But unfortunately, archaeologists are very good at talking to themselves about how useful they might be. And one of the challenges we have is actually reaching out and sharing. And I think you're siloed the idea of how you break across these barriers. So I was jotting down a couple of notes while people were talking, and there's a couple of challenges. One is the uncertainty. So we've got to be quite honest here. The range of options and potential futures are enormous and overwhelming, and it's really easy to think that the answer is to gather yet more data and let's see what happens and monitor it, and at some point the answer will become clear. I think it's pretty obvious that that is not an approach, and I actually have a brilliant Ursula Le Guin quote about how uncertainty is basically the kind of nature of being human, and it's essential for life, which seems to underpin some of what people have said. The second point is that actually some of those superpowers that we have as archaeologists that we need to be able to explain better to others involve that ability to travel through time and space. We are really good at going back in time and thinking at different scales of landscapes and places. And that requires quite a powerful imagination. We don't think of that. We train that out of ourselves. We're scientists, so we write really dull reports about some of the most interesting things that you could possibly say. But I'd like to do a little bit of an experiment with my time travel questions. So I do this often with archaeological audiences. It's more fun with a mixed crowd. So I'd like you to put your hand up. We're going to go back in time, and I want you to keep your hand up for as long as you feel comfortable with that period of time. So who's comfortable thinking in kind of 50-year periods? Anyone? Yeah, a few of you. So keep your hand up if you're still comfortable, if you're thinking in 200-year periods. Yeah, a few people are starting to hesitate. How about 1,000 years? Yeah, we've got down to about half. I'm looking at the prehistorians at the back there. I'm thinking how far we can push this. How about 10,000 years? Yeah, so we're kind of getting back to the last glaciation. At this point, the geologists are feeling really smug. So how about 500,000 years? Anyone up with 500,000 years? Million years? We've lost pretty much everyone except gentleman in the centre there. Oh yes, okay. No,
My group's 200 million.
Oh, brilliant!
So.
There we go. Yes, yeah. Sorry, I wasn't looking over here. But my point is that when we're talking about imagining futures and future change, we each have different go-to time zones. So you often have conversations across disciplines where we don't bother to check in about actually, when I'm talking about a long time, my personal research was 500,000 to 1 million year old human remains and stone tools. I'm very comfortable thinking in millions of years. When I'm talking about deep time, that's what I'm talking about, but that's nothing like your deep time. So, and a lot of people, it might only be decades, it might be centuries. So that ability to create narratives and understanding over varying time depths is something that actually archaeologists are very good at doing. And as I say to them, if we can do that going backwards in time, we should be able to apply that going forwards as well. The other thing is that what stitches that together is that narrative, and that's come up a couple of times. I think our ability to tell very human stories about environmental changes, about places that link people with those through time, is both quite comforting, but also a very helpful way of trying to understand and engage with some quite complex things. So archaeologists stitch together the pieces of evidence of the past, of these places, of these environments, in a way that makes them human-centered. And I know we're talking about crises and the more than human world, but I do think need to acknowledge that the reason we're so bothered about this is because it's about our own survival. We are quite selfish. Everything else would kind of sort itself out, be there in some fashion, but we are quite anthropocentric, and perhaps being a little bit honest about that might help us. There's another sort of analogy that I sometimes use to help explain why archaeology might be useful, and it involves familiarity with the Lego movie. So I'm going to hope that at least some of you have seen that. Yeah, okay, we're good. So if you haven't seen it, the protagonist of this movie, he is fighting against the Kraken. The Kraken likes to fix things, makes the Lego sets, fix them with glue, because you make the set and you leave it, and that's what you do with Lego. And the hero of our story eventually learns to become a master builder, which means he can take those skills honed in the building of the sets and apply them to any situation that might present itself, thereby beating the baddies. And I think there's something for us all in that actually what we're talking about is not learning from past systems to reapply them. I think you made the point that we're dealing with constantly changing systems. Nothing's the same after a natural disaster, a flood, or a big change. But we can be a little bit more like that Lego guy, and we can learn from some of those past experiences and stories and reapply them to these new novel situations. There is a sort of follow-on twist to this as well. I was talking to a former colleague who shall remain nameless, who was explaining that they were terribly frustrated because their child was getting older and it meant there were ever more complex Lego kits, and they had to stay up all night before this child's birthday building those sets for them. I know, I was horrified. The idea that you might build those sets for someone else. But I think there's a lesson in there for those of us with specialisms, that actually our tendency to want to do things for other people, to take that control, to say we know something, we know better, let us do this bit. I think it speaks to some of your the working practices and sort of systems thinking. But actually, if we're serious about societal change and resilience to address the future, we've got to start letting go of some of that control. We've got to start being less like that parent trying to build the Lego sets for people, and perhaps think about how we can share that learning and those experiences of playing with those Lego sets in order to become those master builders and be a bit more adaptable for the future. I'll probably leave it there before I head into a box of Lego bricks.
So I love that you put it in the context of time scales. I've spent a lot of time in the museum design world, and one of the biggest challenges that we face is how do you represent time, deep time scales, and have people understand it, because ultimately you're trying to communicate relevance. So I have a friend who always seems to be in some existential crisis about the state of the world, and he said, why do all these other people walk around and they seem fine and they seem happy, and I'm always concerned about it? And one time I realized that I diagnosed him as a long-term thinker. So what is the challenge when it comes to short-term thinking, when a lot of the solutions that we're really talking about are going to take time before we start to realize the outcomes and the positive benefits of those things? I'm not pointing at any particular person, but it's quite relevant to every single person here and what you're working on.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've observed is that, I think most of us in our disciplines here would have very particular feelings about time and the importance of understanding the sequence of which things happen. Archaeologists are a little bit obsessed with chronology, but I have noticed that, and I like to provoke my fellow archaeologists by saying, you know what, there's a point at which people don't really care. The time frames become a bit meaningless if you're trying to talk to people. There's things happen, like, was it before or after the Romans, before or after Stonehenge? But actually, who knows when that was built anyway? It was a long time ago, a few thousand years. And then there's the point at which, were there even people then, time frame? And then was that the dinosaurs? And the actual details of how long a period of time we're talking about matter less than the relationships and the stories and the connections between that sometimes. But that's a provocation for someone dealing with 200,000 years of...
Anyone else? Johanna?
Okay, just listening to you reminded me of how my child a few years back, when she must have been 5 or 6, she comes back from school and she says, "Oh, we were learning history today." "What did you learn?" "Well, there was Prince." It's like, "Which Prince?" "Prince, the singer. And he is now dead, and that's history. And now we have Bruno Mars because he's alive." And I was thinking, oh goodness, I am ancient now. This is, I am part of history. It's a very scary thing. But I'm using this as a segue to kind of thinking about what we can do within a time frame that's short enough for us to actually make a meaningful difference. And there are so many projects that you can focus on that will fill out the gaps. And I know that you're saying that we maybe don't need more data, and uncertainty is part of life, but sometimes the data is actually useful for helping us live. So there are 2 projects that I'm working on right now. One is actually looking at schools and Prince and Bruno, no, not Prince and Bruno Mars, but looking at schools as urban green spaces. So as you probably know, not everyone can walk into school grounds and count the insect diversity or measure what sort of animals or plants live there. And so because of that, this is a gap in our knowledge. And at the same time, as you have mentioned, both of you, when we look at urban systems, if we have connectivity between green spaces, that allows for nature to be more resilient, to flourish more, because there might be the refuge either in grounds like college grounds or university grounds or council grounds or school grounds. But if we don't have a baseline, if we don't know what is there, then we can't incorporate that data into urban planning. So there is a lot of work being done on this from a teaching and children's well-being perspective, but not that much from an ecological perspective. So that's something that interests me. And another thing that interests me is looking at birds and nest boxes. So a lot of research projects will use bird nest boxes, and the problem is twofold. First of all, the construction of these nest boxes, which are usually made of woodcrete, or if they're wooden, they're not really that well put together, means that they're heavy, they're bulky, they don't decompose well, and also the temperature within them varies a lot. And even a few decades ago, it was fine if a temperature in a nest box was 10 degrees higher than the external temperature, because birds could cope with that. But now, if you have temperatures, even in Europe, reaching over 30 degrees, and the temperature in the nest box is 10 degrees higher, that means that these birds will actually be boiled alive, because their protein will denature at 40 plus degrees, yes? And we definitely don't want that to happen. So if birds nest in natural cavities in trees, they will have an air conditioning system, because you've got water flowing up and down all around them, and the temperature is very stable. But in commercially available nest boxes, that is not the case. So we're right now looking at making nest boxes out of mycelium, so fungus. And this is really nice because it's a material that's lightweight, biodegradable, carbon neutral, and we're hoping that it will have better insulating properties. And the nice thing also is that you can take a mushroom from any area that you're interested in putting the nest box in and grow grow a local mushroomy nest box. So we're trialing it right now, and it's looking at these short-term solutions that will hopefully have an impact, but are not daunting enough to make us think about, is it going to still work 100 years from now? It might, it hopefully will, but I want to have an impact here and now if I can.
That's great. I want to grow a birdhouse out of mushrooms. Sounds amazing. We'll take questions from the audience, but I actually have a question for Ben and Natalie about invasive species. And I think for you, it's invasive thought, right? Like, so a lot of times the ideas and the approaches to things don't always apply. And if we're considering what the state of something is, and we need to move towards something, a lot of times invasive species are standing in the way of either an environment reaching a certain potential or something designed reaching a certain potential. Curious what your response is. Invasive thought and species.
What exactly do you mean by invasive? An ideology? Current
Yeah,
ideology?
I think an ideology. Like,
Yeah.
one idea doesn't always apply in a lot of different areas, and I think it's easy to design and build based on efficiency and just replicate, and it doesn't work in some places, and it holds us back.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we've seen that in the last 100 years, where we've seen a dominant ideology. There's a real problem in the world of the built environment and urbanism, and actually in the professions, where I think it related to an earlier point, which is we've studied this, so we know, and you're just the public, so we'll tell you what you want and what you like, and there's been this complete mismatch between what people are telling us they like and what's actually being provided. We've just done a study actually over a couple of years and found that, surprise, surprise, what people want you can only buy secondhand. Which is a weird thing, isn't it? You'd think that's a market opportunity, but and so the places that people want, whether you think it's the Sunday Times best place to live last year was Saffron Walden, for instance. Vibrant local high street, access to nature, strong sense of community, business opportunities, good schools, blah de blah. And what's being delivered in the new build housing market? Housing estates, monocultural housing estates, cheaply built, and to your earlier point on short investment cycles. So everything's basically built. Public limited company PLCs, volume house builders are essentially working around 6-month yearly cycles of investment. That's how they're measured in terms of success. And 25 years is the maximum investment period of a mortgage. So everything that at the moment is supposed to be delivering our future heritage and the conservation areas of the tomorrow is very short term.
Yeah.
So you look at Edinburgh Newtown, you have, which is what we're promoting, is the idea of how do you incentivize long-term behaviors around infrastructure. So you should be investing in the basic, what's in the ground and below the ground should be on, in my view, 70, 100, even longer cycles. And then what can come and go above ground can be on shorter cycles, but the two aren't the same. So I think one of the problems is that we've inherited this invasion of thought, partly driven in the 30s by the ideology of modernism, which to a large extent rejected history and consigned the past to history rather than living traditions. So you couldn't learn anything from that anymore because we were entering the brave new world. And nature was something that wasn't that great because it degraded. So natural building made of wood. And that's the dominant thought. Guyana, at the moment, we're working in the Amazon rainforest and took a vote with an Amerindian community who, if they had the choice, would build out of wood. Not one single hand went up. Because thatch, wood, all these natural materials, they degrade. So what are people building out of? Concrete, steel, glass. And they want Miami. That's progress. And they want a car. So you can't, to the point of the conversations with people, I can't come in from London and say, oh, by the way, you should live like this. I've grown up with a car, I've lived in, a brick house, but you can't, it doesn't work like that. So I think you need to adapt collective solutions. One, it's a conversation with people to say what works. Two, you need to actually, I think we're at a stage where so much that we've built is poorly functioning, and everyone knows it, and we've got the data now with a lot of digital recording. We've got all the data to show that what we're building is bad for human health, and we can't do anything about it. It's extraordinary, isn't it? So I think we need to recorrect our thought with a sort of massive reality check. And
You were
say,
supposed to be the hope guy.
sorry. It's very hopeful. I'm very hopeful that the world is going to change significantly.
Natalie, yeah.
I just wanted to picking up on the buildings. So, my background's stone tools. I knew very little about buildings, and I joined Historic England and worked there leading climate change and environmental policy work. And I learned a lot about buildings. And the most important thing that I learned was that we massively misunderstand and mischaracterize our historic buildings. And this goes globally, colleagues working around the world on traditional buildings. Vernacular architecture is built of and from a place, using those materials of that place and for the climate of that place. And the characteristics of historic buildings are often presented as being very beautiful and aesthetic, and we want to keep buildings in that way because of the way they look. But in actual fact, the way in which they function and the detailing, so I can see out there some sash windows. Sash windows are brilliant for hot weather. You open the top and the bottom, it allows airflow through. One of the best designs of windows you could have. But I don't think many people who have them understand that purpose. Similarly, the way in which thatch roofs, deep eaves, shed water well away from a building. It's an incredibly sustainable design for a future climate that involves 30% plus more intense rainfall. So there's often these little details and features which we think are terribly lovely and nice and actually are highly functional, but we've forgotten and we've lost. It's back to that connection relationships. We've lost that relationship with those materials, with that understanding of that function, and that's in here and around the world. And so that ideal that's aspired to for that modern concrete building, that's what I want, because that's what I see in magazines or in this is what you do if you've made it. It's all about that broken connection with actually why those buildings are best suited. Sorry.
Yeah. Let's go to the anybody. Yeah.